Hello, and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host, Kupyansk, and in this one there are significant developments in favor of the Russians across the front line. The Russians managed to capture approximately 67 square kilometers since the last update, where the majority of these advances took place within the Donetsk region, from the southwestern outskirts all the way to the Toretsk section of the front line, while there were also some advances within the Sumy region, in the Kupyansk section of the front line, and at the outskirts of the Zaporizhzhia section. Starting out in the south, the Russians managed to expand their zone of control east of Melinivka. They managed to widen the front line in the direction of Olhivsk, as the Russians are looking to align the front line with the river line, while at the same time storming the town itself. In the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over the remaining parts of Komar, gain full control over Peribudova. Fighting continues over the western bank of the Mokryeli river line following the capture of these towns. Russians are also fighting along a wide front on the western bank of the river line towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians along the defensive line here in the southwestern outskirts. Russians also managed to gain control over a significant portion of the fields and forest lines to the north and northeast of Komar, where they are advancing along the Vovcha river line in the southern bank of the river line towards the towns of Zaporizhzhia and Sirka, as well as the fortified positions ahead of these towns. The Russians are looking to gain control of the fortified positions, which will allow them to cross over the Mokryeli river line along the main highway, and to push the Ukrainian positions up against the Mokryeli river line, connecting with the Vovcha river line further north. The Russians are here looking to gain control over both banks of the river lines by advancing alongside the central parts cut off the southern bank of the Vovcha river line, eastern bank of the Mokryeli river line, which will then allow the Russians to concentrate their forces across these river lines near their crossings to establish themselves within the Dnipropetrovsk region and the rear of the fortified defensive line of the Ukrainians here northwest of Velika Novosilka. The Russians also managed to gain control over the town of Zeleny Kut. The Russians are here moving alongside the fortified positions to the south of them. Some sources have started to report that the Russians have also managed to capture some of these fortified positions. The situation isn't clear, as there's been no geolocations and no footage of the fighting within the fortified positions themselves. Instead, the majority of it has been through the towns. It could be that the Ukrainians have practically withdrawn from the towns to these fortified positions, where a few Russian soldiers can gain control over these towns with little to no resistance, where fighting will then follow up along the fortified positions once the Russians storm the rear positions and the supply lines of them during a Ukrainian withdrawal from these towns and fortified positions into the Dnipropetrovsk region. Just to the north of this, the Russians managed to gain control over the majority of Orhova, leaving just a small part of a last remaining street within the town under Ukrainian control. The Russians are moving along the border area to widen their zone of control along the border between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The objective is to reach the supply lines that supplies their defensive positions here to the south near the Vovcha river line. So based on this, we can see that the Russians continue offensive operations on both flanks of these defensive positions, gain control over the towns alongside the highway alongside the Vovcha river line, and to cut off their supplies and establish themselves within the Dnipropetrovsk region for an offensive operation towards Filia and Novopavlivka. To the southwest of Pokrovsk, the Russians managed to gain control over some of the fortified positions northeast of Pyshane, south of Sverove, getting control over the forest patch in the area and the railway connection between Shevchenko and Pyshane. The Russians are here establishing themselves in the southwest of Pokrovsk to create additional supply lines towards the frontline positions here near Sverove and Leontovochi, as they continue offensive operations on the western flank of Pokrovsk, mainly centered around entering the Dnipropetrovsk region, but also alongside the frontline positions here along the western flank of the city directly head on. The Russians also managed to gain control over the first lines here southwest of Shevchenko Pershe, where they are securing the supply lines into Kupcheve. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed full control over Kopcheve. However, no other sources have corroborated that as of yet. The Russians are here looking to establish additional supply lines to the frontline positions to avoid Ukrainian strikes on their supplies that have a heavy impact. They need to spread out their forces when supplying the frontline positions. The direction of Yablonivka, the Russians may gain control over additional forest lines to the south of the town, as well as to the southeast, where the Russians are pushing alongside the additional supply lines that they are looking to gain control of to supply their forces fighting within Yablonivka on a wider front. The Russians are moving eastwards through the town itself and to the south of the town, while at the same time moving northwards along the southern flank of the town on a wide front. The objective is to establish additional supply lines, which will spread out their forces during the supplies and attack the Ukrainians on a wider front, again reducing the effectiveness of FPV drones, which is the main weapon the Ukrainians are defending with. To the southeast of Oleksandro-Kalinove, the Russians made significant advances along the main highway, where they are establishing themselves towards cutting off the main supply line going to the large pocket of towns and fortifications here to the west of Toretsk. Cutting off this road will leave only the singular road here to the south of Leshivka to supply the entire grouping of Ukrainian forces. To the south of the reservoir within the towns of Novospassky, Sherbinivka, Katerinivka, and Klebenbyk, and all the fortified positions on the outskirts of the city. The Russians also moving slightly to the northeast of Romanivka, establishing themselves along the river line towards Katerinivka. The Russians managed to gain control over some of the fortified positions on the northwestern outskirts of Toretsk, and it's expanding the zone of control here along the reservoir to the north of the city, in control of additional fortifications closer to the highway supplying the Ukrainian forces along the industrial zone. The Russians will now be fighting over the last fortified position, which is necessary for the Russians to cut off the rail connection and road connection here along the Kryvyi River. This leaves only a few roads along the reservoir under Ukrainian control and within close proximity to the Russian forces. The Russians need to gain control over this fortified position and then cross over the Kryvyi River to gain control over the forest patches and fortified positions here along the railways to properly operationally encircle the Ukrainian grouping forces in the area, as it would need direct fire control over these positions. But it can already be considered operationally encircled based on the fact that the Ukrainian supplies have to move through a 2-kilometer wide choke point to supply the forces in this entire grouping. The Ukrainians would need a lot of supplies for such a large grouping, which means that they would constantly be throwing the supplies through this narrow gap, which the Russians have direct fire control over about half of it, and they have FPV drones, artillery, and so much else to strike the remaining half of it. So this grouping of Ukrainian forces to the southwest and to the west and northwest of Toretsk is operationally encircled by the Russian forces. Just to the east of this, the Russians also managed to gain control of additional fortified positions to the east of the Livka and to the southwest of the Livka. The Russians managed to storm these fortified positions by cutting off their supplies and isolating them from the rear positions of the Ukrainian defensive area. The Russians are here storming all of the fortified positions and different areas to the northern flank of Toretsk, where the objective is to connect with the Chasiv Yar section, gain full control over the canal on the western bank of it, and to establish themselves to the southeast of Kostiantinivka. The result will spread out the Ukrainian forces, now defending on a wide front. The establishment of the Russian positions here on the northern flank of Toretsk allowed them to push towards the reservoir for this operational encirclement. Further north in the Kupyansk section of the front line, the Russians managed to gain control of additional fortified positions here to the northwest of Stepova Novoselivka. The Russians are here establishing themselves on the northern flank of the highway. They are looking to advance alongside the highway and alongside the railway towards Peshane and the defensive positions to restart the offensive operations here east of Kupyansk. The objective is again widening the front line, gaining additional supply lines to the frontline positions to storm the next defensive lines of the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are working on the defense of the northern flank of Kupyansk and the eastern flank of this pocket. There's been no activity by the Russian forces on the northern and southern flanks of the Kupyansk pocket here to the east of the Uskar River line, and the operations here to the east have just restarted over the past few days, which means that the Russians may restart the operations north and south of Kupyansk as well. The objective again to spread out the Ukrainian forces defending this section of the front line, weakening the defensive capabilities while increasing the supply lines the Russians make use of, which will reduce the effectiveness of Ukrainian artillery and FPV drones. In the northern section of the front line in the Sumy region, the Russians managed to expand the zone of control within Unikivka, advancing both along the highway connected to the Kursk region, along Luknia to the north, and from the highway to the west. Following the capture of Lepnikivka, the Russians have established supply lines to the western flank of Unikivka, and storming Unikivka from these three separate directions is attacking it on a wide front with multiple supply lines, which is the optimal goal of the Russian forces. The Russians also managed to gain control over a fortified position here to the southwest of Unikivka and advancing along the forest lines here to the west of the town. The objective is to cut off any possible connection with Unikivka and the remaining parts of the section of the front line for the operational encirclement of the town. The Russians also managed to gain control over Vereshina and some of the forest lines in the near vicinity and forest patches in the area, as they are looking to flatten out the front line here to the west, gain control of the fortified positions and the forest patch areas, and start storming the towns here to the south. The Russian objective is to cut off this intersection here to the west. However, the Ukrainians have managed to establish themselves where they are creating a defensive line here in the rear. Following the Russian capture of the first defensive line, once they reach the second defensive line, the Ukrainians have established themselves, and now the Russians are trying to take advantage of areas which aren't as prioritized as the intersection, which would have a detrimental effect to the entire defensive line of the Ukrainians. The Russians are now attacking on a wider front, both along the highway to the east, where they are looking to take advantage of the positions that aren't properly entrenched on the Ukrainian side. However, it will not be as effective as when they have captured Unikivka, which still gives Ukraine more time to establish these defensive lines and create a wall for the future offensive operations the Russians have to push through. In conclusion, since the last update, the Russians made significant advances all across the front line, mainly centered around the Donetsk region. However, their advances also expanded in the Kupyansk section of the front line and the Sumy region, where the Russians are currently advancing at a rate of approximately 24 square kilometers a day over the first 13 days of June, where the fastest rate they have advanced since 2022 has been 25.8 square kilometers a day on average in the month of November of 2024. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.